You know that the government has committed £5 billion to invest in new infrastructure to make sure that every part of our country has the best broadband possible.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Chancellor ensure in the budget in March that the automotive manufacturing sector gets the support it requires? He will know that there was a decline last year of 14% in our manufacturing production. Big hit to the Treasury. And make sure the support's in place to ensure a transition from fossil fuels like diesel-powered units, make sure they can still produce those vehicles in good numbers and switch and support the switch to EV.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Just tomorrow I'm attending a roundtable at 11 Downing Street with the advanced manufacturing industry. This is something we're determined, obviously, to take their views into account as we make this transition. We're supporting the industry through initiatives such as the Advanced Propulsion Centre and the Faraday Battery Challenge. We're determined, obviously, to make sure that the sector evolves in a way which boosts their growth prospects as we decarbonise.
Emmy Moore.
Mr. Speaker, last year my town of Southport benefited from a £25 million town deal. Can I ask my right honourable friend what more he is doing to help other towns right up and down the country to also level up?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to it, as the Chancellor said, levelling up across the country. Part of that is our town deals to help revitalise our high streets, but also, as the Prime Minister will talk about later, we unveiled a £5 billion package to improve local connectivity, bus and cycle lanes, to improve both the quality of life in local towns, but also economic opportunity.
Abdul Khan.
Mr. Speaker, back in September last year, standing at that dispatch box, the Chancellor declared austerity was at an end. But just last month, he demanded each government department cut 5% of their budget. Hardly a glowing endorsement of the end of austerity. Will the Chancellor now admit this government never had any intention of ending austerity or easing the pain felt by millions around the country?
With respect, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman is very confused between cutting spending and tackling waste. And we know that the previous Labour government was good at neither of those. You're overspending and loads of waste. It is right that as a government we look carefully at every single pound that is spent and make sure it is done so appropriately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Creditor enforcement action can greatly exacerbate the problems that people going through mental health crises can experience. Can I commend the Chancellor and the Economic Secretary for the Breathing Space initiative, which will help to ease the pressure on them and so many more?
I thank my right honourable friend for his comments. I'm very pleased that the Breathing Space scheme is moving forward. We published the impact assessment last week. 700,000 people will benefit from it next year when it comes into force, and that number will rise to 1 million in the following year.
Sure.
Depending which briefing to which of today's newspapers was accurate, the infrastructure announcement will fund a grand total of either 250 or 1,000 miles of new designated cycleway. That's compared with the 1,800 being provided by the Labour Mayor in Manchester alone. So how can a small city like Exeter hope to get any help, resources or the powers it needs to deliver on the cycling infrastructure it desperately wants to do?
Well, I can tell the right honourable gentleman the announcement today was £5 billion of fresh funding for local transport, that's buses and cycling, and when it comes to cycling, something that we all want to see made easier, more easier to access for all constituents, there will be 250 miles of new dedicated cycle track.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know this government is committed to renewing and improving our national infrastructure. However, those improvements have to represent value for money. Can I therefore urge the Chancellor to question both the cost and effectiveness of the current proposals for a new Lower Thames crossing and suggest he re-examines both the business case and the alternative options?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I understand my honourable friend's concerns, and he's right to raise this, and he'll be pleased that the Highways England is conducting a supplementary consultation of the Lower Thames crossing to make sure that any benefits are maximised. The consultation will close on the 25th of March, and then I would look at it carefully, and I would encourage him to have his say.
Western Weir,
As a former teacher, I know that a good education is a key driver to economic opportunities for young people, but sixth forms have been heavily damaged by years of underinvestment. Will the Chancellor commit to implementing the recent recommendation from the Education Select Committee and Ofsted to raise the rate of funding per pupil to at least £4,760 in the next month's budget.
Well, Mr. Speaker, post-16 education and skills is a priority for the Chancellor and this government. I'm pleased to say the recent spending round delivers a £400 million increase in funding for post-16 education, which makes it the fastest rise in a decade and means that the per-pupil base rate that she talked about will go up faster than the school's total.
Stride.
My right honourable friend the Chancellor will know that I have written to him about the legal duty that the OBR has to produce two economic forecasts in each financial year, which of course has been complicated by the cancellation of the last budget. So could I ask the Chancellor, my right honourable friend, just to set out for the House the approach that he intends to take and how he will avoid the necessity of having two forecasts very close together saying essentially the same thing?
First of all, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on being elected as the chair of the Treasury Select Committee. I look forward to working with him and the scrutiny that he will provide, as he is doing right now. The issue about the forecast that the OBR needs to provide is a live one. We will absolutely make sure that the OBR meets its statutory requirements, and I'm pleased that the head of the OBR, Robert Choate, has discussed it with my right honourable friend as well, and I'd be happy to discuss it with him too.
Robinson.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor will know the association between productivity, economic opportunity and regional connectivity, and noting that Flybe is in the news again today, and knowing how important it is to Belfast City Airport in my constituency and regional hubs right throughout this United Kingdom, will he remember those three principles as he charts a course to find a permanent solution for that aviation company?
Yes, of course, I will keep that in mind, and I want to reassure the honourable gentleman that the government is absolutely committed to spreading opportunity throughout the country. That means each of the nations that make up the United Kingdom, and we want to look at all ways that we can improve connectivity.
Joe Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Goodwin International Training School in my constituency is an exemplar of skills training by a successful modern manufacturer with a world-class reputation. For the less established firms, such as challenger SMEs, what support is on offer to level them up to the Goodwin International standards?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her question. I had a good meeting with her yesterday, along with fellow Stoke and North Staffordshire MPs. The government is supporting small firms across England through a network of 38 growth hubs, one of which is based on Stoke-on-Trent. In our manifesto, we announced our intention to create a national skills fund. This will help to transform the lives of people who haven't got onto the work ladder and lack qualifications, as well as people who are keen to return to work or to upskill.
Victor Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every year, Scotland exports £250 million worth of salmon to the European Union. This week, the Scottish salmon producers expressed a serious concern at the continuing uncertainty of Brexit. What assessment has the Chancellor made of the impact on this vital industry of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster's announcement that as friction-free as possible, trade with the EU means not friction-free at all?
I can assure the honourable gentleman that we are working very closely with the fishing industry, including our salmon producers, to make sure that as we put in place our new free trade agreement, that they will continue to thrive.
We now come to the ministerial statements, and this is on transport infrastructure. I now call the Prime Minister. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'll make a statement on the transport revolution that we intend to bring about. There are all sorts of reasons, Mr. Speaker, why the city in which we now sit is the most productive region in the whole of Europe. We have the time zone, the language, the agglomeration of talents, and above all, we have a mass transit system that every day conveys millions of people efficiently and affordably, with tubes and trains and 8,600 buses into the central activities zone in the morning and out in the evening, like the respiration of some vast undersea salinterate. And as the public transport network has expanded in the last 150 years, it has brought hope and opportunity and job prospects to people growing up in every part of this city and beyond. And it is the ambition of this government to employ that same utensil, fantastic transport infrastructure, to unite and level up across the whole country. And of course, there is far more to do in London, and the present mayor, frankly, needs to be shaken out of his complacency. But there is even more more to do across the nation as a whole. Whether you're stuck in a jam on the A303 or on the outskirts of Lincoln, whether you're trying to get from Warrington to Manchester or toiling across the Pennines by rail, you know that this country is being held back by our inadequate infrastructure. And so, in the next few weeks, this government will be setting out more details of the transport revolution, because we all know the potential of transport to change your life and the life of your town or your city. And we know that efficient transport can clean the air and cut pollution and get cars off the road, and we can simultaneously reach our ambition of net zero by 2050, and we can shorten your commute and give you more time with your family and increase productivity and bring business and investment to left-behind communities. And so that's why we're embarking now on a massive programme of investment in local transport, starting with a record-breaking £5 billion of new investment in buses and bicycles. An investment that will mean bus passengers across the country seeing a dramatic improvement in their daily journeys. More than 4,000 brand new buses on the roads. Zero carbon, British-built buses on the roads of places like Ashfield, Barnstaple, Southampton, Manchester, many more towns and cities besides. More services, including in the evenings and weekends. Simpler, cheaper, and more convenient ticketing. Properly designed priority schemes to speed passengers past the traffic jams. And it's an investment that will also mean cyclists enjoying hundreds of miles of brand new separated lanes with mini Hollands blooming like so many tulips in towns and cities right across the country. And that £5 billion, Mr. Speaker, is just the start. My very good friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, will be making a full announcement in this month's budget, and I have no desire to steal his thunder. But I can signal today that we are taking forward transformative investments, improvements from Cornwall to the A1 north of Newcastle, from South Salisbury to South Ribble, from Cheadle to Chiverton, dual carriageways, roundabouts, bypasses, underpasses, and those are just the roads. We have already set out plans to explore new investments in the rail network across the north, developing proposals to reopen the Fleetwood line in Lancashire and the Ashington-Blythe rail line in the north-east, improving track and platform capacity at Middlesbrough Station, installing new signalling at Harrogate, one of North Yorkshire's busiest stations. And further south, I can today announce that we will be upgrading the Bristol East Junction, a major pinch point in the rail network of the south-west that limits access to the Brunel-designed Victorian splendour of Bristol Temple Meads Station. Mr. Speaker, the transport revolution is local, because it must be local. We can unite and level up across the country with fantastic local improvements. Better rail, less congested roads, beautiful British-built buses, cleaner, greener, quieter, safer, more frequent. And above all, we can improve the quality of life for people and improve their productivity. We make places more attractive to live in and to invest in. But we cannot make these improvements in isolation from one another, because we'll only be doing half the job. We will not fix the great musculoskeletal problem of UK transport. Yes, we must fix the joint between the knee bone and the thigh bone and the shin bone and the ankle bone. And yes, we must fix the arthritis in the fingers and the toes. But we also have to fix the spine, Mr. Speaker. And our generation faces a historic choice. We can try to get by. We can try to get by with the existing routes from north to south. We can consign the next generation to overcrowding, standing up in the carriageways, or we can have the guts to take a decision. No matter how difficult, unlike the party opposite, by the way, Mr. Speaker, no matter how difficult and how controversial, that will deliver prosperity to every part of the country. 50 minutes off the time to Glasgow. When it comes to advocating HS2, it must be said that the task is not made easier by HS2 Limited, the company concerned. Speaking as a Member of Parliament whose constituency is on the route, I cannot say that HS2 Limited has distinguished itself in the handling of local communities. As everybody knows, the costs forecasts have exploded. But poor management to date has not detracted, in my view, from the fundamental value of the project. The review recently conducted by Douglas Oakervie, copies of which will be placed in the Library of the House, leaves no doubt of the clinching case for high-speed rail. A vast increase in capacity with hundreds of thousands of extra seats, making it much easier for travellers to move up and down our long, narrow country. And that means faster journey times. Not just more capacity, it means faster journey times, extraordinarily fast journey times. Passengers arriving at Birmingham Airport will be able to get to central London by train in 38 minutes, which compares favourably, Mr. Speaker, you will note, with the time it takes to get from Heathrow by taxi, a point I just draw to the attention of the House. But this is not just about getting from London to Birmingham and back. This is about finally making, considerably faster than the Piccadilly line, this is about finally making a rapid connection from the West Midlands to the Northern Powerhouse, to Liverpool, to Manchester, to Leeds, and simultaneously permitting us to go forward with Northern Powerhouse Rail across the Pennines, finally giving the home of the railways the fast connections they need. And none of it makes any sense without HS2. The Infrastructure and Projects Authority considers that this first phase can be delivered for its current projected costs of 35 billion to 45 billion in today's prices. The designs have been improved immeasurably thanks to the tireless contributions of campaigners, including my right honourable friend, the member for Chesham and Amersham. I don't think she's in her place. And if we start now, services could be running by the end of the decade. So today, Mr. Speaker, the Cabinet has given high-speed rail the green signal. We are going to get this done. And to ensure that we do so without further blowouts on either cost or schedule, we are today taking decisive action to restore discipline to the programme. I will be appointing a minister whose full-time job will be to oversee the project. A new ministerial oversight group will be tasked with taking strategic decisions about it. There will be changes to the way HS2 is managed. We will, in line with Mr. Oakervie's recommendations, be interrogating the current costs to identify where savings can be made in Phase 1 without the costs and delays that would be associated with a detailed redesign, and so that the company can focus solely on getting Phases 1 and 2A built on something approaching time and budget. I will be creating new delivery arrangements for both the grossly behind schedule Euston terminus and Phase 2B of the wider project. But before those designs are finalised and legislation introduced, we will also present an integrated plan for rail in the north. Informed by an assessment from the National Infrastructure Commission, it will, in line with the findings of the Oakervie review, look at how we can best design and integrate rail investments across the north, including Northern Powerhouse Rail between Leeds and Manchester. And I've just spoken to the Mayor of Greater Manchester, who has warmly welcomed this project, which I committed to supporting, by the way, I seem to remember, during my first days in office. I want the plan to identify the most effective design and sequencing of all relevant investments in the north. For example, with many in the north crying out for better east-west links instead of improved north-south ones, which you've heard many times in this House, some have suggested delaying or even cancelling HS2 in order to get Northern Powerhouse Rail done more quickly. But I want to say to you, Mr. Speaker, and to the House, this is not an either-or proposition. Both are needed. and both will be built as quickly and as cost-effectively as possible. And to make sure that happens, we will, working closely with northern leaders, explore options for creating a new delivery vehicle for Northern Powerhouse Rail. And we will start treating HS2 north of Birmingham, Northern Powerhouse Rail and other local rail improvements as part of one integrated master plan, High Speed North. Because something has to change, Mr. Speaker. And those who deny this, those who say we should simply build 2B and Northern Powerhouse Rail, according to the plans currently on the table, are effectively condemning the North to get nothing for 20 years. And that would be intolerable, Mr. Speaker. So as we draw up this plan, we are not asking whether it's phase 2B or not 2B. That is not the question, Mr. Speaker. The question is how we can bring a transport revolution to the north sooner. And together this revolution in transport, in local and national transport, has the potential to be truly transformative for the entire country. And yes, it is ambitious, but ambition, frankly, is what we have lacked for far too long. 2 centuries ago, our ancestors would have been content with, could have been content with breeding faster horses. Instead, they invented the railways. They created the transport network on which the United Kingdom rose to economic preeminence. They looked to the future of transport and they made it happen. And today, it is our duty to do the same. Let us bring about a future where high-speed trains glide between our great cities, where electric buses convey us cleanly around our towns, where self-driving cars roam along roads that are free of the congestion that causes so much pollution, and where a new generation of cyclists pedal safely and happily to school and work in tree-dappled sunlight on their own network of fully segregated cycle paths. This government, as we did in London, this government will deliver a new anatomy of British transport, a revolution in this nation's public transport provision, and a sign to the world that in the 21st century, this United Kingdom still has the vision to dream big dreams and the courage to bring those dreams about, and I commend this statement.
Jeremy Corbyn. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. Once again, we see the government taking ideas from the Labour Party adopting our language, but falling very long way short on the substance of it. This, Mr. Speaker, is a government that's unwilling to make the scale of investment needed to revive parts of this country that have been decimated by successive Conservative governments. It's a government that's proved itself unable to manage infrastructure projects properly and incapable of keeping a lid on the costs.
Absolutely.
Today's piecemeal announcements don't add up to a serious plan to rebalance the economy or to tackle the serious climate emergency that we all face. They don't even come close, Mr. Speaker, to repairing the damage done by a decade of Tory government. But it's true, you know it. The Prime Minister laments our inadequate infrastructure. Yet it's his party that's been starving the country of investment over the last 10 years, resulting in the worst regional inequality in Europe. Today, the Prime Minister is selling his announcement as a prize for parts of the Midlands and the North. I simply tell him this. People in those regions to whom he promised so much in the general election are going to be sorely disappointed when they see what actually happens. Take HS2, for example. The Labour Party supports HS2 as a means to boost regional economies and reducing climate emissions. It's essential for boosting rail capacity and freeing up other lines for increased freight use, etc. But we don't see why the government should get a slap on the back for announcing it's going ahead. After all, it's only because of the abject failure of successive Conservative governments to keep on top of the costs that the project's future was put in doubt in the first place. Today's proposed boardroom shake-up comes far too late to avoid the public having to fork out tens of billions more than was forecast in the first place. It's money that's already been wasted because of the incompetence of this Tory government and its predecessors. The leaked Oakervie review is going to come out later, apparently, was correct to say that HS2 must be fully integrated as part of the modern railway system. It must extend to the great northern cities, linking up with Northern Powerhouse Rail and eventually to Scotland to end the need for domestic flying in this country at the earliest possible opportunity. So, we are concerned that the links to Manchester and Leeds are now under review and could reportedly be even downgraded. HS2 must be developed with more sensitivity to local communities and much more sensitivity to the environmental impact, particularly on modern and ancient woodlands across this country. And if it's to have public support, the fares on HS2 must be affordable and comparable with the rest of the fare system on the railway network. Can the Prime Minister tell us where the trains will be built? Will those jobs and training be done in this country? But also, Mr. Speaker, what about other parts of the country, like, for example, the far southwest? When will the Prime Minister match the £2.5 billion commitment to upgrade the Great Western Main Line as our only train line into the southwest? We need to have better connectivity beyond Bristol to Devon and Cornwall. We believe that the case is now unanswerable that our railways, Mr. Speaker, should be publicly owned and publicly run to improve the service and cut fares by 33%. Does the Prime Minister recognise that too many people are simply priced off the railways? The average commuter is now paying £3,067 for their season ticket, £873 more than when the Conservatives came into office in 2010. Why won't the Prime Minister cut the cost of travelling? Why should people in Britain have to pay so much for expensive fares, more expensive than any other comparable country? Mr. Speaker, when I first raised the question of buses at Prime Minister's Question Time, I was ridiculed by many Tory MPs and many in our media. From the look of the front pages of our papers today, those same quarters now regard the focus on buses as a political masterstroke. Well, I take the credit for it, it's fine. But in reality, Mr. Speaker, what the government have said today about buses is frankly woeful. They've cherry-picked policies from the Labour manifesto, but underfunded them. It doesn't make up for the deep cuts since 2010. Funding for buses has fallen by £645 million a year in real terms since 2010. 3,300 routes have either been cut or withdrawn, and fares have soared at 2.5 times that of average wages. It's councils that keep bus routes open. We need long-term funding for our local authorities that have suffered such severe cuts and now face a further £8 billion black hole over this Parliament because of underfunding. And the government is still refusing to give all councils the powers to improve local bus services and the option of public ownership of their services. On cycling, all he's offering actually is 250 miles of cycle routes. Our manifesto promised 3,300 miles of cycle routes all across the country. Again, it's just plain inadequate by this government. Underinvestment by the Conservatives has created problems that they are forced to acknowledge, but they simply aren't serious about fixing them. Regional inequality is going to be solved by... Is regional equality going to be solved by 10 free ports? Isn't this just a gimmick, really creating storage spaces for the super-rich to dodge taxes and launder money? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is clearly fond of announcing big, shiny projects, like the scheme to build a bridge over the Irish Sea. Why not go the whole hog and make it a garden bridge? connected to an airport in the sea. It stands as much chance of actually being built as any of those failed projects by the former Mayor of London put forward. Or, Mr. Speaker, why not a cable car between Scotland and Northern Ireland? Or better still, a giant zip wire. The Prime Minister could be the first to try it out. The saddest thing, Mr. Speaker, about today's announcement is the high likelihood that so much of it won't be delivered. With the Prime Minister demanding 5% cuts in the very departments that are supposed to carry these policies out, I fear that those communities that desperately need investment in new infrastructure are going to be let down when today's headlines become yesterday's news and they find that nothing has changed.
Sorry. Just help the House. I'm expecting to run this to around 1:40. So some members may not get in, but if we all help each other, it will be much nearer to getting everyone in. Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thought the right honourable gentleman did a manful attempt there to conceal his fundamental agreement with what we're doing, and you know he raised some interesting points. Actually, we're doing a transport revolution across the whole of the southwest, not only investing in the seawall at Dawlish on the railways, but we'll of course be upgrading the roads, the A303 through the southwest. We'll be doing improvements in Wales, and I think it's high time, by the way, that the Bryn Glas tunnels were unblocked. We encouraged the Labour government in Wales to do that. HS2, of course, don't forget, brings 50 minutes off the journey time to Glasgow. Every part of this country benefits. As for fares, I would just remind him that fares rose twice as fast under the Labour government. And the whole point of the honourable gentleman is trying to interrupt me from a sedentary position. I would remind him the whole point of putting in another 200,000 seats in capacity is that you thereby drive down prices for the consumer. It's about competition. Mr. Speaker, he made a heroic attempt to cavil and disagree with what is fundamentally a wonderful project for this country. He even tried to dislike our bus plans. I don't know quite. No, he claimed them for himself. Mr. Speaker, I'll take that. The Leader of the Opposition, as far as I understand the position, actively supports the announcement of the government today, and I congratulate him on that.
You, Merriman.
The additional £5 billion for buses and cycle links is greatly welcomed. Last year, the Transport Select Committee called for additional funding in buses and a buses strategy, both of which are coming to fruition. How will the Prime Minister ensure that the money allocated to local authorities for these projects is spent by local authorities for these projects? Will it be ring-fenced? And if not, how will we really ensure that we are levelling up for our public transport system?
Well, I congratulate my honourable friend for the work he does for his community, and I can assure him we will ensure that when money is allocated for buses or for cycling projects, it is spent on buses and cycling projects.
Stand it. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of the statement. Let me be mindful of one reality. No number of Prime Ministerial vanity projects will ever heal the economic damage and the damage to connectivity which this Tory Brexit will inflict. In terms of the HS2 announcement, enhanced rail infrastructure is obviously welcome, despite the indecision and the waste that has been synonymous with this project. We will wait and see if the Prime Minister is capable of getting this decision through his own party and past his own chief adviser. However, if the Prime Minister is truly committed to rail connectivity across these islands, will he engage with the Scottish Government to improve rail links from Scotland to the major cities of the north of England, such as Manchester, Newcastle and beyond? Will he also explore collaboration on the extension of the Borders rail line, and what resources will be provided? The Prime Minister may talk about his priorities of one nation. We know what nation he's talking about And, Mr Speaker, it certainly doesn't include the Scottish nation. Can I further ask, given his previous opposition to the Barnett formula and his party's repeated failure to fully implement it, can the Prime Minister confirm if all of the spending that he is determined to engage in will be subject to Barnett consequentials? Yes or no? I welcome the fact that the UK Government is following the lead of the Scottish Government, who announced a £500 million bus infrastructure programme last September. Mr Speaker, given the Prime Minister's previous association with buses, can the Prime Minister reassure the House that false advertisements will be banned from the new bus fleet? And finally, on the bridge, this is a Prime Minister that couldn't even build a bridge across the Thames. He'll therefore have to forgive those of us that are sceptical that he can build one over the 20-mile expanse of the North Sea. Will the Prime Minister therefore provide the estimated £20 billion for his project to the Scottish Government and the Northern Ireland Executive so they can spend those money on our own priorities?
Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, I can assure the right honourable gentleman that we will of course collaborate with the Scottish Government on projects that I think will be of massive benefit for the whole of our United Kingdom. And on his substantive question about Barnett consequentials, there of course will be Barnett consequentials as far as the buses are concerned. I'm afraid I'm not following him in building on all the as far as his plan to build a bridge across the North Sea. Mr Speaker, I think he needs to look at the geography of the United Kingdom again. Indeed, the only obstacle standing in the way of HS2 is the crackpot SNP plans to put an economic border between England and Scotland, break up the United Kingdom and have a border at Berwick.
Andrew Mitchell.
My right honourable friends, a comprehensive announcement today will be very widely welcomed across the West Midlands and in Birmingham, and nowhere more so than in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield. Will he today pay tribute to the superb leadership marshalling the arguments of our West Midlands Mayor Andy Street and the case that he has put which will underwrite our economic prosperity for the future?
Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. I salute the work of Andy Street, his vision for transport in the West Midlands, and that will be supported and encouraged and fomented by HS2.
Red Stringer.
Mr Speaker, I very much welcome the announcements as far as HS2 and the integration into HS3 is concerned. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that his statement could also be improved and bring more immediate jobs to the north of England if, as well as building HS2 from London to the north, we also started building HS2 from the north to the south? And finally, for real ambition, would he not agree that HS2 should go to Scotland, which would help to unite the two countries?
Mr Speaker, I will certainly get on with building Phase 2A immediately, but I can tell him that HS2 already does go to Scotland. That's one of the great advantages of this project.
Michael Fabricant.
The Prime Minister will understand that Andy Street and I tend to talk about soft furnishings as it tends to avoid argument, because I'm less than enthusiastic about the route of HS2, which neither connects with Eurostar nor with Birmingham New Street or indeed with St Pancras. But I'm delighted to hear that the Prime Minister has said that the organisation of HS1 Limited will be revised. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that it's very, very important that, as HS2 now is going ahead, that we also compensate well those people in my constituency and his who will be affected by HS2?
Mr Speaker, the short answer to that is of course.
Lillian Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The confirmation that the full HS2 route has been given the go-ahead is welcome news, and there's a strong case for building the Birmingham to East Midlands part early. But if this project is to deliver on its potential for our region, we need assurances that the Phase 2B bill will receive royal assent in this Parliament, that it won't be delayed further or downgraded to cut costs. Will he give those assurances today?
Yeah, of course, Mr. Speaker, we are committed to Phase 2B, but I think she would appreciate that now, given what's happened in the past 10 years with Phase 1, it is vital that we use this inflection point to make sure that the taxpayer gets maximum value as we proceed.
Victoria Prentice.
Speaker. The Right Honourable Lady for Cheshireman Amersham, who is recovering from a major operation, has asked me to thank the volunteers and donors from all over the nation who have fought against HS2 over the past 11 years. The last 3 years have given us a few lessons in what gracious defeat looks like. And while I remain worried by the environmental, financial and governance issues of this project, I really do wish it all the best. I was particularly pleased to hear what the Prime Minister said about the northern section and the speed by which he needs to deliver that, and about buses and bikes. Can I ask the Prime Minister one ask, Mr. Speaker? Holistic approach to blight. If it's impossible to regrow ancient trees or to get rid of congestion where there is congestion, can we please compensate communities by, for example, building their local hospital?
Mr. Speaker, what we can certainly do is ensure that where there is environmental damage, and we must say, of course, that there will be effects on woodlands. There we must restore them. We're planting 7 million trees, which is many more than will be destroyed.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While on balance, I welcome the news that HS2 has been given the go-ahead for the capacity gains which will benefit the North West region and for the construction and rail supply firms in my constituency, who I hope will receive a fair shot at winning contracts associated with the project. My constituents in Culture, Croft, Risley and Hollins Green in particular will be looking for assurances that the unnecessary Goulburn Spur will be removed from the proposed route. This is an issue that transcending party affiliations, local MPs are in agreement on. Will the Prime Minister give those assurances?
Mr. Speaker, I've heard representations on the Goulburn Spur from many sides of the House, many people in this House, and we will certainly be looking at that.
Sir Graham Brady.
Can I welcome the increased priority for Northern Powerhouse Rail and the link from Manchester to Leeds in particular? But can I also ask my right honourable friend to ensure an urgent review of parts of the route for 2B, including the Goulburn Spur, entirely unnecessary and likely to cost over £1 billion, completely wasted money, but also to look at the fact that the station for Manchester Airport, absurdly, isn't at Manchester Airport. It will be built on ancient woodland in my constituency at Davenport Green instead.
My right honourable friend makes an excellent point, both about the Goulburn Spur and Manchester Airport, and we will certainly be looking at both those.
Munira Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Key to cutting carbon emissions and tackling climate change is cutting domestic flights and moving people onto our railways. That's why the HS2 announcement is to be welcomed, and building a third runway at Heathrow is an act of environmental vandalism. Will the Prime Minister now prove his credentials on climate change, make good his promise of lying down in front of the bulldozers, or, far more simply, just cancel the third runway?
Mr. Speaker, I see no bulldozers at present, nor no immediate prospect of them arriving.
Polly Latham.
Local authorities have limited resources to deliver their new local cycling walking infrastructure plan. Would my right honourable friend the Prime Minister support the delivery of parts of those plans through appropriate local charities such as the Derwent Valley Trust in Derbyshire that are capable of implementing key sections of the network?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I think it would be very important that we collaborate with appropriate delivery vehicles such as the charity that she mentions.
Meg Hillier.
Speaker, it's good to have certainty over HS2, but the Prime Minister has unveiled a raft of big spending projects. Where's the money going to come from?
Mr. Speaker, the money is coming through the hard work and effort of the British people, and this government will manage our finances prudently and ensure that the economy is not wrecked as the last Labour government succeeded in doing.
HS2 will connect with the Elizabeth line and Heathrow Airport at Old Oak Common Station, a station that will become every bit as famous as Victoria or Waterloo. But Old Oak Common will neither be old nor common. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that we should have a name in keeping with its importance and iconic, maybe after the first woman Prime Minister of our country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is a brilliant idea. Let's try that one out on the Mayor of London.
I asked the Prime Minister about the prospects for change in relation to the eastern leg of 2B. The original HS2 vision was to serve and regenerate our towns. But in South Yorkshire, our towns are facing all of the pain and none or very little of the gain. And can I commend to him the HS North concept, come up with by local campaigners, they got there first, which actually has a plan, an integrated plan, to help towns like Doncaster and Mexborough.
Mr. Speaker, he makes a very good point on behalf of Doncaster, and we are certainly looking at the HS plan that he mentions.
Sir William Cash.
The Prime Minister knows how bitterly disappointed my constituents in Staffordshire will be about the decision. Could I simply ask him, when he's considering the question of review, to include Phase 2A from Birmingham to Crewe and the rest of that part of the constituency which is going to be so badly affected, because we need to have a proper link with Handsacre to make sure that Stoke and Stafford are properly serviced. Does he understand that, and will he do everything to make sure that we're kept in the review?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. On Handsacre, he has my full support.
Hilary Benn.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement, but given what he has said about reviewing Phase 2B, could he tell the people of Leeds when he now expects the new HS2 station to open?
Mr. Speaker, we'll get it going as soon as possible.
Jones.
Speaker, can I congratulate the Prime Minister on that statement? He's so right when he says the economy of the North needs both east-west and north-south connectivity. Does he agree with me that the challenge we face in transport is not, as sometimes articulated, between local or national investment? What we need is both.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and you can't have the gains of one without the other. Local productivity won't be boosted unless we improve national connectivity up the spine of this country. That's what HS2 is all about.
Lucy Pole.
Mr. Speaker, I strongly welcome the announcement today on HS2, but let's be clear, the question mark was written by the Prime Minister and his government, and it shouldn't have been written at all. But under the terms of the review we're now seeing, can he ensure that the full benefits of NPR and HS2 are fully integrated at Manchester Piccadilly Station and that no stone is left unturned in making sure that that can happen?
Yes, I certainly can, Mr. Speaker.
Eddie Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, infrastructure costs are frequently driven up by unforeseen ground conditions. Can the Prime Minister remind the House of the commitment by this government to increase spending on research and development, such as Birmingham University, who are working on quantum technology to map those ground conditions?
I thank my honourable friend. He's entirely right, and HS2's investment will not just drive the construction sector, it will drive the economy across this country, including higher education.
Jonathan Edwards.
The last time I looked at a map, London, Birmingham, Manchester and Leeds were all in England. So can the Prime Minister explain why does Scotland and Northern Ireland get 100% Barnett rating from HS2 whilst Wales gets 0%?
Well, of course, as he knows very well, if he looks at the map, that North Wales will indeed benefit from the Crewe link. But I might say to the representative from Wales that actually it's high time that the Welsh Labour government got on and delivered the M4 bypass at the Brinkglass tunnels, and we in this government will get on. If they won't do it, we will.
Andrew Bridgen.
HS2 is unloved, unwanted and has been grossly mismanaged. It very adversely affects my constituents. Does the Prime Minister appreciate my and my constituents' concerns that this could well be an albatross around this government and the country's neck moving forward? And doesn't it set the bar very low for the future delivery of infrastructure projects on time and on budget by all future governments?
Mr. Speaker, every great infrastructure project is opposed by the people at this stage. The M25 had 39 separate planning. The Treasury was against the M25. I seem to remember delivering the Olympics, not to speak of Crossrail, with the Treasury trying to get rid of Crossrail. Every single infrastructure project is opposed at this critical moment. We've got to have the guts, the foresight to drive it through.
Jim Warren.
Mr. Speaker, in London, and thanks to the Hopper fare of City Khan, I can travel across the entire Greater London area on 2 buses up to 30 miles for £1.50. In Newcastle, £1.50 will barely get me 4 stops up the West Road. Yeah. Will this funding bring north-eastern bus fares into line with those in London, or is this all bluff and bluster signifying nothing?
I'd remind the Honourable Lady that bus ridership has fallen catastrophically under the current Labour Mayor because of his mismanagement of the system. Crime has risen precipitately. And we will ensure not only that we drive down crime in spite of what the current Labour Mayor is doing, but we have fantastic, cheaper, greener, cleaner buses across the country.
Mary Robinson.
Speaker, I welcome this statement and particularly the decision to start treating HS2 Northern Powerhouse Rail under the local rail improvements as one integrated master plan, High Speed North. As this is brought forward and the design stage is brought to us, how are we going to ensure that local business leaders and communities are included in what's best for their area locally and in terms of this High Speed Rail project?
Mr. Speaker, we'll make sure that businesses and communities are fully involved in the preparations for High Speed North.
Sir George Hammer.
The devil, Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister well knows, is in the detail. Could I cautiously, though, welcome the announcement on HS2 and the announcement about linking up the Northern Powerhouse great city, during the course of which the Prime Minister referred to and Liverpool. Could he give us some indication as to what he meant by that?
Mr. Speaker, that's at the next stage of the consultation.
Neil Clark.
The government has ended uncertainty for those who want HS2, but will my right honourable friend the Prime Minister also end uncertainty for my constituents in Stafford who have waited years for their houses to be bought and for compensation to be paid?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we'll do just that. And I apologise to everybody for the uncertainty that's been involved.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the commitment both to HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail, but in neither case did the Prime Minister mention Sheffield. Would he therefore confirm that the Sheffield Loop will go ahead as planned on HS2 and that the Northern Powerhouse Rail improvements are not just about Manchester to Leeds, but Manchester to Sheffield as well?
Mr. Speaker, we're proceeding with the whole of the HS2 plan, but as the House will appreciate, given what has gone before, it is right that we interrogate the methods and the costs as we go forward with phase 2B.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend knows I don't agree with the decision he's reached on HS2, but I respect the fact it was a difficult decision, and I'm grateful to him for listening to both sides of the argument before he made it. Now that it is made, isn't it right that HS2 Limited need to not just compensate more swiftly and more fairly than they have, but also communicate better than they have with those affected by the line? And will he make that specifically part of the remit of the new HS2 Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I think my right honourable friend is absolutely right. I think the record of HS2 in engaging and in communicating with local people has been woeful, and we will ensure that changes from now.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said it was the SNP that were standing in the way of high-speed rail to Scotland. In fact, it's his government that are doing that. So can you tell us precisely what year will the line be extended to Scotland?
Well, I'm delighted in the first place that he supports high-speed rail, that he supports HS2, and as I say, the only obstacle to that great project is the deranged SNP plan to install an economic barrier between the UK, including an immigration barrier, for all we know, between the UK and between England and Scotland.
Amanda Soloway.
you, Mr. Speaker. I am delighted by the statement today. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that not only does it support the growth in the North, but the Midlands as well, including the constituents and businesses of Derby North?
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for her support. And if you could just go to the Midlands, and you can see the investment already flooding in as a result of HS2. Let's turbocharge that now.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's kind of funny in a way to see the Prime Minister come here to gleefully re-announce a project that he himself and his office tried to put a stop to. But whilst he's in train set building mode, can I draw his attention to the Wrexham to Bidston line that would connect North Wales and Liverpool? And will he put some extra investment in there so that we can speed up improvements?
We will certainly examine very carefully the proposal that the honourable lady makes and whether it qualifies under our £1.5 billion beaching plan.
Craig Whittaker.
Friend knows the Calder Valley has been hit again with the third most devastating flood in 7.5 years. Getting across the Pennines at the best of times is a struggle, let alone when you've been flooded. So the news about Northern Powerhouse Rail is fabulous news for us in the Calder Valley.
Hear.
But can my honourable friend assure the House and members that we won't wait for HS2B to be determined before we start Northern Powerhouse Rail?
No, my honourable friend, well, first of all, I extend my commiserations to all the people of Calder Valley who've experienced flooding. We all know how traumatic a flood can be. But I can assure him that we will certainly allow no delay in pushing ahead with all the branches of the project.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. The HS2 project, albeit somewhat shambolically handled, is great news for England. But it shows once again the contempt with which this government holds the people of Wales. The entire budget for electrifying the main line to Swansea would be less than 1% of the vast sums that are being talked about today. So will the Prime Minister today commit to electrifying the main line to Swansea, or will he continue to hold the people of Wales in contempt?
Mr. Speaker, as he knows, as I've just said to another honourable gentleman, the North Wales will benefit from the line to Crewe, and as for the line, we already have electrified the line to Cardiff. We already have electrified the line to Cardiff, and I urge him to get on to his friends in the Welsh Labour government and tell them to stop. They squandered £144 million on a study for the bypass of the M4, which they then decided not to do.
Stephen Hammond.
Speaker, can I warmly welcome what my right honourable friend has said today, particularly the announcement of HS2 and the review of the governance arrangements. But can he confirm that he will also use this as an opportunity to embed the skills we need to deliver that infrastructure and open academies such as the Tunnelling Academy he opened during the Crossrail construction period?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I remember well working with my right honourable friend on that project and many others. This will drive jobs and apprenticeships for young people for a generation to come.
Andrew Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome, to use the Prime Minister's own words, his investment in the skeleton of the UK economy, the thigh bone, the knee bone, the ankle bone, but he has forgotten about the red hand of Ulster, which appears to be detached from his plan. Could he outline for us what procurement opportunities and what project opportunities there will be for Northern Ireland, including a commitment to a bridge between Northern Ireland and the UK, which would improve the sinews of the arm and the attachment of the hand to the rest of the body?
And I want to say that the honourable gentleman's characteristic optimism is in marked contrast to the negativity that we heard from the leader of the opposition. Of course, there will be opportunities for procurement in Northern Ireland and indeed elsewhere, and buses spring to mind.
Rachel McLean.
Mr. Speaker, Redditch is only a short hop away from HS2 terminus in Birmingham, so we welcome today's announcement. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that because my constituents have the highest rate of going to work by bus, Redditch is the perfect candidate for Britain's first all-electric bus town?
What a brilliant idea, Mr. Speaker.
Mike Marr.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This is welcomed, if not delayed, news, in particular for Manchester and Greater Manchester more widely. Can we ensure, though, that the Metro mayors and the council leaders are hardwired into the review, but also, in the way that's already been suggested, we do consider also starting at Manchester and meeting in the middle to make sure that we get the benefits early on, particularly for education, schools and jobs in my town?
Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman. I can say that we will indeed be working with the Metro mayors and already are consulting them on exactly that.
Andrew Percy.
We've had the fluffy end of the lollipop for too long in the North on transport funding, so I absolutely am made up by this decision on HS2 and HS3, and I support my honourable friend in Doncaster North's comments too. Can I ask him also, though, to look at the Operator Service Option Fund for underutilised line? There are just 2 services on the Goole-Sneath-Leeds line every day. That's not enough to allow the people of Leeds to come and enjoy Goole. So can he please look at that and ensure that we make these underutilised lines better used?
Yes. Mr Speaker, I'd be only too happy to look in detail at the Goole-Leeds line to see what we can do to assist. We'll suck it and see, as they say.
McKinnell.
Mr Speaker, Newcastle and the North East need this infrastructure investment in both HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail without any further delay. So can I make a very immediately deliverable improvement to our national infrastructure that will ensure the North East and Newcastle are NPR and HS2 ready by investing in our East Coast main line, which needs urgent infrastructure investment between York and Newcastle?
She makes an excellent point, and we are indeed upgrading the digital signalling on the East Coast main line.
Mark Palsy.
The Prime Minister spoke about the spine of our rail network, and that's currently provided by the West Coast Main Line, and the upgrade that received a few years ago led to many businesses being attracted to Rugby. What reassurance can he provide to them that with HS2 bypassing Rugby, we will continue to retain fast services on a well-maintained railway?
I've looked at this very issue. I thank my honourable friend. I've looked at this very issue, and I'm convinced that it will continue. The existing capacity will continue to be extremely important, and will continue to drive jobs and investment in Rugby, where he and I think, opened a fantastic new electric taxi factory.
Matt Kane.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Despite going under my house, HS2 will reduce journey times from Manchester Airport in my constituency to London from 2 hours 24 minutes to 59 minutes, opening up a plethora of opportunities for the poor people of the South East, for the great city of Manchester. The Prime Minister's dodged the question, Mr Speaker, from my friend from Oldham and from Blakely and Broughton. If he wants to level up and have a northern powerhouse, why doesn't he start building the line from Manchester down?
Well, Mr Speaker, we're building Northern Powerhouse Rail as fast as we possibly can, but he will appreciate that that project is not in a state of readiness of the Birmingham to London route.
Edward Jepson.
Do we realise more benefits for towns like Winsford in my constituency by integrating Northern Powerhouse Rail, the conventional rail network and HS2? And can my right honourable friend confirm that the Cheshire salt mines and the threat of sinkholes will be considered as part of the next review?
Mr Speaker, I can certainly confirm that the threat of sinkholes from the Cheshire salt mines will be considered as part of the review.
Ruth Cummins.
I welcome the announcement that the northern section of HS2 will go ahead because, crucially, it will be integrated with NPR. As the Prime Minister said, this country has been held back by inadequate infrastructure. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that Northern Powerhouse Rail must include a city centre stop in Bradford?
I thank her for the representation she makes on behalf of Bradford. I see exactly the point that she makes. I will be consulting on that issue very shortly.
To Kieran Mullen.
I welcome the announcement today. The Prime Minister has well and truly swept the leaves off the line of transport infrastructure investment in this country. I know businesses in Crewe and Nantwich will benefit locally, not jobs and businesses in London, but locally in Crewe and Nantwich. When it comes to bus investment, can we ensure that local residents get a really strong voice in deciding where these new buses go and how often they go there?
Of course, Mr Speaker, it's vital that the expansion of local bus services should meet local demand. In my experience, there is no shortage of local demand in most parts of the country.
Lucas.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. HS2 is a dire reflection on this government's environmental credentials, with the destruction of 100 ancient woodlands and a miserably small modal shift of just 5% of passengers who would otherwise fly or drive. Indeed, the government's own figures show that HS2 does not cut carbon emissions. So if it is to go ahead, then surely it should be required to meet, at the very least, the European average for high-speed rail modal shift, which is 15% for cars and 30% for planes. Why doesn't it?
Mr. Speaker, we've just announced the biggest ever package in history for electric, for zero-carbon buses and possibly hydrogen buses as well. And HS2 is the most low-carbon, most efficient way of getting around this country. I think that will nothing please them.
My right honourable friend, can I congratulate him on actually grasping the nettle and building the infrastructure in the north. It's really welcome. It delivers on the manifesto promises. Part of the problem with the rising costs in Leeds is because of the incompetence of Leeds City Council and a Labour leader who, quite frankly, couldn't organise an event at one of the local breweries, putting this station in a totally inappropriate place. Could I ask my right honourable friend, as part of the review, to look properly at where the station is located and make sure that, as part of the review, he takes account of being able to use existing rail routes and infrastructure?
Mr. Speaker, we will be making sure as we go forward, and there's going to be a review, I must be clear with the House, we will be going forward with the whole programme, but we will be ensuring that we get proper value and proper political leadership and grip of the whole programme.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. For 4 decades, the East Midlands economy has been losing skilled work, and it's caused extraordinary damage to our communities. HS2 is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reverse this decline and to add tens and tens of thousands of skilled jobs to our community. The Prime Minister has taken a difficult but very welcome decision. Can he reassure East Midlands people that there won't be any unnecessary delay to HS2B and that Midlands Engine Rail will be woven into the scheme as well?
Yes, I can, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Particularly welcome the Northern Powerhouse Rail connection with HS2, but could I also ask him to look at the procurement process and make sure that it's our UK-based companies like Hitachi Rail in my Sedgefield constituency that get a real chance at getting the business out of this, and can it be done as quickly as possible so that they have an opportunity to plan the procurement?
I want to thank my honourable friend. He has lobbied me personally several times on this very issue, and I can assure him that the plant in question and the jobs in question will be uppermost in our minds.
Stephen Flynn.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. At the last count, HS2 was projected to cost the City of Aberdeen £220 million. Based upon that figure, would the Prime Minister agree that HS2 will be an economic disaster for my city?
On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, HS2 will shorten journey times across the whole of the United Kingdom, including and particularly Scotland, and indeed, as I said earlier on, there will be Barnet consequentials following from the fantastic announcements we've made today about buses and other modes of transport.
Croft.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your statement and your vision to power up the North through transport. Historically, Scunthorpe steel has been used for many national infrastructure projects, such as HMS2, Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier. Does he agree with me that we should be using our world-class steel, such as the steel we produce in Scunthorpe, for projects such as this?
Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to the workers of British Steel and what they do. Most of our train tracks come from British Steel, whether in Scunthorpe or elsewhere, and we will do our utmost, notwithstanding the difficulties that plant currently faces, we will do our utmost to ensure that remains the case in the future.
Mr. Speaker, when we were first talking about HS2 10 years ago, we were not talking about a climate emergency. Given the landscape has changed in that respect, surely the government should be significantly investing, much more than being proposed today, behind regional, sub-regional transport systems, buses and cycle routes, on the level that the French and Continentals are doing.
Mr. Speaker, I think I can say without fear of contradiction, I've built more cycle lanes than anybody else in this House. But you know, even what I did, not always popular, but what I did is nothing compared to what we are about to do. The investment we are about to make in buses is absolutely colossal, and I'm surprised that he finds grounds for criticism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome my honourable friend's attention to the spine of the country, but will he apply his orthopaedic talents to what should be the muscular limb that connects London to Hastings, which it will take longer to get to than the hour it will take to get to Manchester in future?
My right honourable friend makes an extremely good point, and I will certainly examine the London to Hastings route. I don't know which part of the anatomy it should be, but it is vital to our nation's prosperity, whatever it is.
Miss Brown.
Is the Prime Minister seriously suggesting that there will not be a single extra penny as a result of today's announcements for Wales? And before he gives me any bluster about anything else, the truth of the matter is they promised that they were going to electrify the line all the way to Swansea. They said that by 2017 the Valley's lines to my constituency would be electrified. None of that came to pass. All we want is a new railway line in the Rhondda Fach and to open the tunnel from Blaencombe to Blaengwynfi. Will he promise that today?
Mr. Speaker, as I told the House already, we've electrified the line up to Cardiff, and when it comes to tunnels, the Welsh, it's not a widely known fact, Mr. Speaker, the Welsh Labour government, which he supports, which spent £144 million on a study about whether or not to open the Bringlass tunnels, open those tunnels, open the nostrils, unblock the nostrils of the Welsh dragon, Mr. Speaker.
James Cartridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the statement, and particularly my right honourable friend's commitment to a more convenient ticketing system. Many of my constituents commute into London 3 or 4 days a week for a better work-life balance, but find they have no choice but to pay the cost of a full-time season ticket. So can I urge him to ensure that the current trial of part-time season tickets is rolled out nationwide, so we have a ticket system that suits the modern-day reality of our flexible labour force?
My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, assures me that that is indeed his intention.
Emma Hardy.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we've had 10 years of rail downgrades in Hull, from cancelling electrification to older tracks taking longer to arrive at their destination. And while I would like to welcome Northern Powerhouse Rail, I have to say, Prime Minister, I'm slightly disappointed that whenever you mention Northern Powerhouse Rail, you mention it between Leeds and Manchester, when we all know it begins in Hull. So I would like from now on the Prime Minister to talk about Northern Powerhouse Rail as being from Hull, and also to tell me when are we going to see the benefits in my constituency.
Mr. Speaker, the road to Hull is paved with good intentions, and we intend to build it. We will make sure that we have Hull as fully as part of our vision for high-speed north, and I'm sure her contribution will be warmly welcomed.
Miriam Cates.
I thank my right honourable friend for his announcement, and I agree that we need both buses and trains to connect our communities. But can he reassure my constituents in Penistone and Stocksbridge, which has many rural areas, that investment in buses will benefit our rural towns and villages and not just our big cities?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and that is indeed the point of the investment in buses, because everybody knows, from talking to our constituents, that a decent, reliable bus route can be absolutely transformative of your life and the prospects of your kids. So we will be doing it across the country.
Andy Slaughter.
Speaker, with Birmingham Airport 30 minutes from Old Oak, we won't need a third runway at Heathrow. I'm sure that he will agree. But is HS2 going to terminate at Old Oak for 3 years while Euston is still under construction, as the press are reporting? And if so, what will he do about the disruption and overcrowding at Old Oak? It's already the biggest development and interchange site, and is very happy with its historic name, by the way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his support for the name Old Oak Common. We will make sure that we take control properly of the management of that fantastic project. There is huge potential for success at Old Oak, and indeed it presents a potential link, of course, between the Great West Line and HS2, and we will ensure also that we take control properly of what's happening at Euston, which I think he would agree has been a shambles, and we have a special purpose vehicle established to get the maximum value for the taxpayer from that project.
Simon Hall.
Speaker, I welcome entirely the statement of my right honourable friend. Anybody who's interested in increasing productivity in global Britain could not fail to do so. In response to the question that he was just a moment or so ago asked, can I ask him to take into account with regards to the rural provision for buses? Social mobility in our rural areas really does need a boost. These buses can actually help achieve that. When taking these funding decisions, can rural sparsity be taken into account as one of the triggers?
Yes, of course. Rural need and rural sparsity will certainly be taken into account, as we will take into account the needs of all towns and communities. And it's not only that these buses will help people to get to work or to wherever they need, but of course what they do is they give businesses the certainty and confidence that they can invest in that town in the knowledge that they will have people who are able to commute easily.
Kate Green.
Welcome to today's announcements both on rail and on buses. And in relation to buses in Greater Manchester, could we have an urgent decision now on funding for the Clean Freight and Clean Bus funds?
Mr. Speaker, these will be the cleanest, greenest buses this country has ever seen, but we will certainly be making use of the Clean Bus Fund.
Greg Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I urge my right honourable friend, and indeed anybody that seeks to celebrate the HS2 decision, to keep central in their mind the blight that it will bring to communities up and down the route, not just on the landscape, but people's lives. Throughout the enabling works so far, people have been left in severe financial hardship. Can we actually have an independent body with real power to scrutinise every decision that HS2 Limited makes?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is entirely right in what he says, and I speak as an MP for a seat on the route where, like his constituency, thousands of people have faced confusion and uncertainty about HS2, and it is vital that people are properly compensated and properly treated, and that's why the Construction Commission will be looking at making sure that everybody is treated fairly.
Alison Toulis.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Scottish environmental journalist Rob Edwards has been warning since 1995 about the munitions dumps by the MOD in Beaufort's Dyke, the deepest point in the North Channel of the Irish Sea and exactly on the route of the Prime Minister's latest fantasy bridge. Will he instead abandon this project and give the money instead to the Northern Irish and the Scottish governments directly so that we can invest in the priorities for Scotland and Northern Ireland rather than his fantasy plans?
Speaker, we will be bringing forward proposals in due course.
Harriet Baldwin.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as a West Midlands MP, I warmly welcome today's announcement and thank the Prime Minister, the Transport Secretary, and for working with West Midlands Mayor Andy Street. Can he confirm that as we move towards net zero, that this extra capacity on our railways will allow lorries carrying freight to come off our motorways?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. That is one of the many advantages of the proposals before the House today.
Rupert Hutt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a nearby West London MP, can I ask the Prime Minister over to my patch, where HS2, Crossrail and Heathrow are already impacting lives, and deliver the much-promised His Ministers will know visit that I've been promised for years now, to see what the reality on the ground of a super development opportunity area looks like for people who tend to be forgotten between historic Euston and countryside beauty.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have fond memories of walking the streets of her constituency and listening to her lobbying me in person, and no doubt that I'll be doing so again all too soon.
Jason McCartney.
Does the Prime Minister agree with me? We now have a wonderful opportunity to win hearts and minds on High Speed North by getting thousands of SMEs involved in procurement, tens of thousands of young apprentices getting trained up, the Huddersfield University Institute of Railway Research doing innovation, and most importantly of all, fully integrating it with Northern Powerhouse Rail, linking the northern cities and my local town of Huddersfield.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend speaks eloquently and passionately for Huddersfield, which is amongst the many towns and cities that will benefit from HS2.
Hope House.
Deputy Speaker, to announce 250 miles of new cycle routes as a big green infrastructure investment is a complete joke. It will only mean a few extra miles per local authority, and we as cyclists know what they look like. So if he agrees that we need many more continuous segregated cycle routes, how can he begin to explain how 250 miles across the country will cut it?
Mr. Speaker, this is just the beginning.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you. I'm delighted to hear that when it comes to buses and bikes, we're all going Dutch. Will my right honourable friend make sure that rapidly growing areas like Essex and the east of England get our fair share of the funding?
Yes.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker.
Ruth Cadbury.
Deputy Speaker, to double the rate of cycling from 2% to 4% of all trips will, according to government figures, need £5 billion worth of funding at least. So how much of today's announcement of £5 billion for buses and cycling and walking will actually be spent on cycling?
At the first stage, 350 million.
Order. Statement, Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Matt Hancock.
Madam Deputy Speaker, with permission, I'd like to update the House on the response to the Wuhan coronavirus. I've laid an instrument before the House to confirm the power that we've taken to isolate those at risk of spreading the virus, and, if necessary, to keep them isolated as part of our belt and braces approach to protecting the public. The powers are proportionate and will help us slow down transmission of the virus and make it easier for NHS and public health staff to do their jobs. The clinical advice about the risks to the public has not changed and remains moderate. As of today, 8 people in England have tested positive for coronavirus. All are receiving expert care from the NHS, which is well prepared and equipped to deal with this kind of situation. Contact tracing of the first 4 cases has been undertaken rapidly and is now complete, while tracing for the latest 4 cases is ongoing. This contact tracing itself identified 5 of the cases, a tribute to the skill and tenacity of Public Health England staff, as well as finding a further 5 British nationals in France who've also tested positive for the virus. They are now receiving treatment, and the Foreign Office is following up with consular support. On Sunday, Madam Deputy Speaker, 105 more British nationals and dependents from Hubei province landed safely at Brize Norton. They are now in isolation facilities at Kents Hill Park in Milton Keynes and are receiving all of the necessary medical attention. I want to pay tribute to the Foreign Office, the MOD, as well as Milton Keynes Council and Milton Keynes Hospital and my own team for their hard work and efficiency in ensuring that this all went smoothly. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is of course in addition to those now reaching the end of their isolation on the Wirral. Turning to the efforts to contain the outbreak in China, the Foreign Office is advising against all travel to Hubei province and all but essential travel to mainland China. Last week, we issued new advice to all travellers returning to the UK from China, Hong Kong, Macau, Malaysia, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan and Thailand. That advice is clear. If you develop symptoms of cough, fever or shortness of breath, you should call NHS 111 and immediately self-isolate for 14 days, even if symptoms are minor. If you've returned from Hubei, you should self-isolate and contact NHS 111, even if you have no symptoms. My officials discussed the incubation period with the World Health Organization this morning. The current evidence shows that a 14-day incubation period remains appropriate. We'll continue to monitor emerging evidence closely with our international partners. And, Mr. Speaker, as I said last week, dealing with this disease is a marathon, not a sprint. The situation will get worse before it gets better. We will be guided by the science. Be in no doubt, we will do everything that is effective to tackle this virus and keep people safe. We're investing 40 million in vaccine research, are working with international efforts on therapeutics, and today I can announce to the House the immediate launch of a capital facility to support any urgent works the NHS needs for the coronavirus response, such as the creation of further isolation areas and other necessary facilities. Finally, Mr. Speaker, there are actions each and every one of us can take, simple but effective steps like washing hands and using tissues. Madam Deputy Speaker, we will take all necessary precautions to keep the public safe, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State Jonathan Ashworth.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance notice of his advance sight of his statement and advance notice of the regulations he was going to invoke yesterday. Our thoughts must be with all those who have been diagnosed with novel coronavirus and those in quarantine, and I place on record again our thanks for NHS staff, public health staff and all other staff who have been involved in responding to the outbreak. On the specific issue of the quarantine arrangements, I understand the approach the government has taken, and actually he will recall that in last week's statement I asked him what would happen should an evacuee wish to leave Arrow Park. In response, he understandably reminded the House that evacuees had signed contracts that effectively offered passage back to the UK in return for compliance with the government's quarantine arrangements. However, given questions were raised around how practically enforceable those contracts were, and indeed wider questions about what was allowed under human rights legislation, I understand why the Secretary of State has invoked the regulations that he's entitled to do under the Public Health Act. He has our support. Quarantine arrangements must be seen to be necessary, proportionate and in accordance with law. And enforcement of those quarantine arrangements, including with powers of restraint where necessary, must be fully transparent, and the rights and freedoms of the quarantined evacuees must be fully understood so as to ensure they are treated with dignity and respect. So we agree that a legislative framework for this is far preferable to ad hoc contracts that were the original basis for the quarantine. And in order to maintain public confidence in these arrangements, that framework must be understood and scrutinised by Parliament. With that in mind, with respect to the instrument he has laid before the House yesterday, at what point will the House get an opportunity to consider those regulations, and will that be on the floor of the House? I appreciate he isn't one of the business managers, although there's a government reshuffle, so who knows by the end of the week, but if he could give us some clarity at this point on that front, we would appreciate it. Turning to the UK response more generally, can he tell the House if he is asking CCGs and trusts to make plans should this outbreak turn into a pandemic in the coming months? And what work is he doing to ensure those local plans are robust, and can he guarantee that they will be fully resourced? And what communications have directors of public health in local authorities received, and how will they continue to be kept informed? Is he confident that 111 has sufficient capacity to deal with increased calls? And will those community health trusts, who I understand will be tasked with visiting suspected patients in their homes to carry out swab tests, will they be given extra resources to scale up capacity, or will they be expected to fund this extra work from their existing baselines? With respect to the capital facility he has announced, I understand hospitals have been given specialist pods to quarantine patients and access to this facility. Can he tell us if GPs have the necessary equipment and resources to cope with patients who may present with novel coronavirus, and will they be able to apply to this capital facility? I welcome the advice of the Secretary of State on travel arrangements, not least because of with school holidays coming up next week. There'll be many people wanting clarification. Can he assure us that Foreign Office advice is fully aligned with Public Health England advice? And can he tell us what monitoring arrangements are in place at airports for flights returning not just from China but from other places across the world where there has been a coronavirus outbreak? Finally, can he update the House on international efforts to share research, intelligence, as well as attempts to find a vaccine, and on what timescale? He will know there was a summit at the World Health Organization today, for example. But on behalf of the official opposition, can we again thank all our hard-working NHS staff, particularly those on the front line, some of which themselves have been diagnosed with coronavirus. And we reiterate our hope and thanks the Secretary of State for coming to the House, and hope that he will continue to keep the House updated in the weeks ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I'm grateful for the support of the opposition for the measures that we've taken, and the best way to deal with an outbreak like this is on a bipartisan basis, and I think that the approach that the House has taken has thus far helped enable as efficient and capable a response as is possible to what is obviously a difficult situation. I entirely agree with the Honourable Gentleman that the use of the powers that we brought into force yesterday must be proportionate and enforcement too needs to be reasonable, and that is a very important consideration. He's right to ask about NHS 111. We'll ensure that NHS 111 services have the support available. We have plans in place to expand the support on for those taking the calls on 111 if necessary. Thus far, we haven't had to do that because compared to the huge scale of millions of calls to NHS 111 that are made, the number concerning those who have think that they may have coronavirus is still relatively small, but of course we stand ready to do that if necessary. In terms of timing, the business managers, as far as I understand it, have not yet scheduled the debate on the affirmative procedure for the statutory instruments that I presented yesterday. They are made affirmative, as in they become law the moment that they're signed, and thus are law now, and they remain in force with the requirement for the House to debate and pass them, and in fact the whole of Parliament to debate and pass them within 28 days, and we will ensure that that happens. They then stay in force for 2 years or until the end of this public health emergency is declared. He asked about links with the local authority in Brighton, an incredibly important question, and I understand that the links have been very close, and the public health officers in Brighton have been working very closely with Public Health England, and I would thank them as well. He asked about access for capital to GPs. Of course, if GP facilities or if other parts of the NHS need capital upgrades, then yes, we will look at them. In the first instance, though, it's very important that people don't go immediately to their GP, but rather call NHS 111, and if they do go to A&E, we'll ensure that these pods are available to make sure people are separated from the vast majority of people going to A&E who we don't want to get contaminated. But the advice here remains absolutely clear, which is if you suspect that you may have coronavirus, then call 111 and do not leave home until you have spoken to a clinician.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Health Secretary for the way he's handled this crisis, because we are all very aware that appearances before this House are only a tiny fraction of the huge amount of work that is going on behind the scenes. And also thank the Shadow Health Secretary for the non-partisan way that his party is approaching this public health crisis. One of the most distressing things you see on TV about what's happening in China, in the affected province, is people being denied basic hospital treatment because the hospitals are full, whether or not it's because of coronavirus or another illness that they happen to have. Could I ask the Health Secretary just to give some idea of the preparations that are being made to protect people who will continue to have urgent illnesses like cancer that will continue to need to be dealt with very, very promptly, even in such a situation as the virus exploding in the UK?
Well, of course, this is a very important strand of our prepare and mitigate part of our policy to ensure that should things get worse here, then the NHS is fully prepared. The NHS has the capability now to cope with the very highest level of intensity and isolation with 50 cases, and the capability to expand that to 500 cases, and to do that without an impact on the wider work of the NHS. But of course, if the numbers of cases get bigger, then we will need to take further steps. And as he knows from his time in my shoes, there are extensive plans already in place for how that should happen if we reach that eventuality.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I too welcome the Secretary of State's statement, and we support the use of powers to maintain isolation, as this is critical for the health safety of other people in the country. I would, however, also support that these must be transparent and proportionate. I also welcome that the 4 chief medical officers across the UK are working together on this. Now, the government is advising symptomatic returnees from the high-risk countries, but should it not be all people returning from the high-risk countries? Because we simply don't know what the prodromal part of the incubation period is, nor how infectious someone actually is before they have any symptoms at all. And I have to say, I was surprised to see the bus drivers who were driving those on their way to quarantine sitting in the front seat in shirt sleeves, beside someone in full hazmat gear. So that, to me, seemed to send out a rather strange message. It's also advised that only those from Hubei province should self-isolate, even if asymptomatic. But we see from the cases in France that this is spreading very quickly, and we already have 40,000 cases across 28 countries. And therefore, if anyone is flying and going through airports, there is the risk of spread, of simply being on an aeroplane with someone coming from China. I welcome the funding into vaccine research and the expansion to 12 test centres across the 4 nations. But what publicity campaign is planned to educate the public up front not to go to their GP and not to go to accident and emergency, where they will actually spread it to someone else? I understand the information is there on the Scottish Inform system or 111, but if someone isn't looking, maybe we need to be proactive about the message. And finally, the UK is no longer part of the European Centre for Disease Control, and while we're able to take part of the early warning and reporting system during transition, we're no longer part of the decision-making or central procurement of vaccines. So how much of that system is the UK still able to be part of at the moment during transition and in the long term? And does this perhaps raise up the agenda some of the areas of cooperation that need to be sought with the European Union agencies?
Hear, hear. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I'm grateful for the broad support expressed by the Honourable Lady, and I'm also very grateful for the work of the devolved authorities in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and the work of the 4 CMOs across the UK who've worked very closely together on what is a public health emergency. To answer her specific questions, all of those returning from any of the named countries, which I reiterated in my statement, should, if they are symptomatic, should self-isolate. We're taking all measures that are deemed to be effective on the clinical advice, and as a clinician herself, I'm sure she will recognise the importance of following the epidemiological science wherever possible to make sure we take steps that are going to be effective and are proportionate to the scale of the challenge. She also asked about monitoring of those returning on flights. We have enhanced monitoring in place for all those returning, as I said. She also asked about a publicity campaign to get the message across that people, both in terms of what people can do, that is to say that people should wash their hands and follow the catch it, kill it, bin it, tissue use campaign, but also the important message that the first thing you should do is call 111. And we have that. We do have a very significant publicity campaign, and I will double check that is being coordinated with the devolved authorities, which I think it is, but I will double check because that's very important. But overall, I would say that, and finally, I'll answer the point about the bus drivers. That was again a decision that was taken on clinical advice to promote the safety of the passengers and balance all of the considerations that needed to be taken into account.
I'm going to spend approximately 20 more minutes on this statement, so I would urge brevity in questions and answers. Maria Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State said in his statement that this public health emergency is likely to get worse before it gets better. So could my right honourable friend just reassure the House today that we're well prepared for any new cases in the UK and that the NHS has the capacity to cope with those new cases wherever they occur across the country?
Yes, of course I can give that assurance, and we've been clear all along that we have expected cases and that we're doing everything that we can, but we also need to prepare for what might happen in future.
Angela Eagle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given that we're now experiencing spread between people who have not been to China, as the Brighton cases show, can the Health Secretary say something about how people can distinguish between the ordinary symptoms of flu and the novel coronavirus symptoms? Because China isn't now the only lexicon.
That's a very good point. People should follow the clinical advice in terms of the symptoms they have, and also, of course, being much higher risk if they have travelled to one of the affected areas. But in that case, then they should call 111 and present and have the test. And the testing is available precisely to distinguish, because it's not reasonable to ask ordinary members of the public to know the difference between an old coronavirus and the novel coronavirus, or indeed between flu and coronavirus.
Dr. James Davis.
Deputy Speaker, could my right honourable friend provide an update on the likely timescales for the development of a vaccine for Wuhan coronavirus and Britain's contribution to that?
We put £40 million into the both global and domestic efforts to find a vaccine, and work is underway fast. And that work is progressing, but the time taken not just to develop a vaccine, but also to ensure that it's assured and that it's safe to use, it does take time, and is in the nature of these things that because of incubation periods and the nature of the science, it does take that time.
Clive Efford.
Madam Deputy Speaker, should the outbreak become more widespread, can the Secretary of State say what advice he's preparing for employers? Because many people, such as those in 0 hours contracts, will be severely financially penalised, which creates a big incentive to turn up for work when you're feeling ill. Exactly. So can he say what preparations he's making for employers to avoid those circumstances? Yes.
That's an important consideration. That could become an important consideration in due course. I'm glad to say at the moment the impact in terms of employment is very, very small, because we only have 8 cases, but I'll certainly take that into consideration.
Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for updating the House today, and can I say I think that statement will be reassuring to my constituents, some of whom have contacted me with concerns about the way the disease is spreading. So will he continue to keep the House updated, particularly as infection control measures are rolled out, should they be necessary?
Well, I hope I've demonstrated my willingness to keep the House informed. I think in the way that we respond to these public health emergencies, it is incredibly important that we are clear and straightforward and transparent with the public. The ability to communicate what is inevitably a fast-moving situation is always a challenge. But I'd pay tribute to members of this House for responding in a, of course, probing but reasonable and sensible way, and indeed to large swathes of the media who have reported on this coronavirus outbreak in a way that is essentially guided by the science.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Brighton and Hove, our thoughts are with those who have tested positive in our city and those linked to them who are in isolation. He will know that there are real concerns locally with another health centre closing today. People need and want more timely and accurate information, not just about washing hands and tissue use, vital though that is, but about things like what does self-isolation actually look like. I think we need a much higher profile public health campaign. So what steps is he taking to work across departments, including with education, with DWP and so on, to proactively disseminate key public health messages without causing panic or compromising patient confidentiality? And could he also assure me that the FCO consular departments are proactively offering support and assistance to people isolated in countries like France?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady makes an important point, especially in relation to communicating through, for instance, the Department for Education and schools, to make sure schools get the reassurance that they need. I would pay tribute to the way that the Honourable Lady has conducted herself, given that it's the number of cases in her constituency and the impact on local health services. We have taken action urgently where the contact tracing has shown that action needs to be taken, and we'll take that proportionate action. But I'm also very keen to be able to provide reassurances to people that we are taking the action that's needed and that the threat to the public remains moderate, even as we've seen the increase in numbers.
Oh, Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, in my local hospital, the staff there are being provided with specially fitted masks to ensure for their safety when treating patients who may or may not have the coronavirus. Can the Secretary of State confirm this is part of a wider package of policies and procedures ongoing in the NHS to keep our staff safe when treating these patients?
Well, yes. Of course, this is a very important consideration, making sure we've got the equipment to keep our staff safe. Because keeping medics safe is very important for the, not only for them but also for the public, because they do such an important service.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much. Madam Deputy Speaker, could the Secretary of State tell the House what the latest scientific advice he has had on when, we all hope, a vaccine might be available?
Secretary of State.
Well, the estimates vary. And the answer is uncertain. There are promising signs of the very early stages of development seeing breakthroughs, but after the early stages of development, there then need to be pre-clinical trials and then clinical trials to make sure that any vaccine is safe, and especially given that thankfully the mortality rate from this coronavirus appears to be relatively low at around 2%. Therefore, it's very important that a vaccine doesn't do more harm than good. And so we are both, I'm pushing as fast as I can the development of a vaccine, but I'm also highly cognizant of the scientific advice of the need to ensure that it's safe.
Richard Drax.
Speaker, on the point of mortality, can I ask my right honourable friend, there are leaked reports came out of China that those who are dying are considerably more than we first anticipated. Is that true? Is that what he's hearing? And can he also just tell the House and thereby the country who is most vulnerable, who is most likely to be really seriously affected by this terrible disease?
Well, of course, it's difficult in a country dealing with a very large-scale outbreak, as China is, for the information to be completely accurate. What I would say is that a report published in the last 48 hours of a study of 1,099 cases from China has demonstrated that in those 1,099 cases, the number of children who have been affected and symptomatic is very small, and that gives us hope and some evidence that the impact of this is largely on the elderly and the frail, less so on people of working age, and much less further on children, which is a very good thing, obviously for children, but also because in a flu, if children are spreaders, then they tend to spread fast. So that's the latest scientific advice coming out of China, but just by the nature of the challenges that the Chinese health system is facing, it is difficult to get an entirely clear picture.
Munira Wilson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, on the various questions he's fielded on the timescales for a vaccine, if I may be so bold as to help him out, the Chief Medical Officer told MPs last week that nothing less than a year should be promised in terms of development of a vaccine or a treatment. Does he agree with me, therefore, that this is very much a long-term solution and we must redouble our efforts in terms of that public communication campaign on preventative measures and self-isolation measures?
Yes, I do, and the isolation in particular, the two go hand in hand, and the things that people themselves can do to play a part in combating this virus, leading with washing your hands, using tissues, and then for those who are symptomatic, calling 111 before they go to a doctor's, and self-isolating where necessary.
Ben Everett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I start by thanking the Secretary of State and his team for keeping both me and my colleague in Milton Keynes South up to date throughout this process. It's been a very worrying time, but that information has been very useful for me. And I'm sure the whole House would join in with the congratulations for the professional way that the local healthcare professionals, including Milton Keynes Hospital and beyond, and the wonderful workers at our local authority, the officers at the council, have risen to the challenge of hosting a coronavirus facility in Milton Keynes. And also, it's probably worth pointing, Madam Deputy Speaker, the police who now have additional powers to keep that site safe. So can the Secretary of State assure me and the people of Milton Keynes that all the appropriate processes and procedures and powers are in place to keep our residents and their families safe?
Well, I pay tribute to my honourable friend and indeed his colleague, the member for Milton Keynes North, who as a whip can't speak, but who has also been working incredibly hard on behalf of people in Milton Keynes to reassure them, exactly as he says, to reassure them that whilst Milton Keynes has welcomed another 100 people from Wuhan and they're safely now in Milton Keynes, the council and the hospital have gone out of their way to make this as efficient as possible and also to make those returning from Wuhan comfortable.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituent's mother-in-law and mother has been visiting them from Wuhan on a 6-month visa that is due to expire at the end of this month, and normally she'd expect to go home. So what advice is the government giving to visiting Chinese nationals, particularly from Wuhan and Hubei province, about extending their visas in this unusual situation? I can't see anything on the UK government website, but I can on the Norwegian government website.
I'm very happy to ensure that that case can be taken up with the Foreign Office.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I congratulate my right honourable friend in the way that he and his officials, and indeed across the House, the non-partisan way this has been approached to handling this crisis and making sure that the threat remains at moderate. But my concern, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that by broadcasting that the threat is moderate, people may become complacent. So could I ask my right honourable friend, as has been mentioned before, to increase public health messages? I've heard them on the radio, but it struck me that when I was at motorway service stations on the way down yesterday that I did not see public health information there, and in an area of hand washing and bathroom use that would probably be quite advisable.
Secretary of State.
That's an excellent idea. We're open to all ideas of that kind, and I'll look directly into it.
Kevin Brennan.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Secretary of State for coming to the House and making the statement. This use of the term super spreader in past outbreaks, often people categorised in that way have been demonised. And I wonder if the Secretary of State could take this opportunity in front of the House to explain to people that someone under this so-called, who are so-called super spreaders may have absolutely no idea that they've contracted the virus and should in no way be blamed or demonised for its spread.
I think this is a really this is a really good point, and I want to make 2 points on this. The first is that those who've contracted the virus are ill, and they deserve our sympathy and our support. And I know from the incredible way that they've responded to the need to undertake contact tracing, that all of those in the UK who we've been working with because they've been tested positively, all of them have acted in a way that is completely exemplary, have done everything that society could have asked for of them to make sure that that the virus is contained. And I want to pay tribute to the way that they've responded to public health officials and, of course, the NHS, and thank them for doing that. The second point I want to make is in response to something connected, which is that anybody who thinks that it is appropriate in response to this challenge to demonise or abuse anybody of the British Chinese community or anybody of Chinese or indeed East Asian origin is completely wrong and is being counterproductive to the efforts that we have across the country and across the world to tackle this virus.
Alex Chalk.
I thank the Secretary of State for his measured statement. Does he agree with me that we should not allow our proper focus on the risk of coronavirus
to blunt our efforts in respect of seasonal flu, which, as the Chief Medical Officer indicated, kills around 8,000 people a year. And in those circumstances, the precautions that are being taken of washing hands and observing basic hygiene is important for all sorts of good reasons.
Well, it's absolutely true that washing your hands and catching it, binning it and killing it are the right response to flu as well as to coronavirus. And of course, we are coming towards the end of the traditional flu season, and this year, thankfully, the flu season that we had in England was in December, and thus far, touch wood, has largely mitigated and gone away. But of course, for next year, we will be even more vigilant than normal.
Stephanie Peacock.
Deputy Speaker, with regard to the capital facility announced, can the Secretary of State outline the total amount of funding allocated to the NHS, and can he say whether this is new money or whether it's a loan that will be required to pay back?
This will be new money to those NHS organisations who are bidding for it. We haven't put a cap on it. We're inviting bids from NHS organisations, and we'll very rapidly assess those bids.
Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With universities in Northern Ireland cancelling trips to China individually, can the Minister outline whether the Government intends to issue guidelines to stop travel between and to infected areas, and further, if there is any intention to do routine tests on anyone at all recently returned from travel from the infected areas?
Well, we do have enhanced monitoring in place on the flights from the areas that I mentioned, which is important. We keep all options under review. Of course we do, because the most important thing is to follow the scientific advice wherever possible and to keep people in this country safe.
Business statement, Leader of the House.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I informed the House last week of this Government's intention to introduce legislation to stop the automatic early release of prisoners convicted of terrorist offences. Today, the Government will introduce that legislation, and tomorrow's business will now be consideration of a Business of the House motion, followed by all stages of the Terrorist Offenders Restriction of Early Release Bill. Thursday's business will be as previously announced, a general debate on matters to be raised before the forthcoming adjournment. I shall also make a further statement announcing future business on Thursday.
Hello, Leader of the House, Valerie.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Leader of the House for advance sight of the emergency business statement. We on this side again repeat that terrorist prisoners should not be released automatically, but subject to parole board assessment before release while serving their sentences. Can I just ask him 3 quick questions? Firstly, when is the bill likely to be published? Will it be published immediately after this statement? And what sort of timetable does he have in mind for tomorrow in terms of protected time? And could he, thirdly, clarify